This is United States History 201, Presentation 11, the Washington Presidency. So what we're going to do in Unit 3 material is go through the first 5 administrations, starting with George Washington and ending with James Monroe, and look at the major issues that are going on during that period of time. So there's a lot of stuff here, so let's go ahead and get started. All right, so after the Constitution is ratified by the states, there's an election, and George Washington, as expected, was elected first president of the United States. He, of course, lived from 1732 to 1799. He is from Virginia, and he is the most important man in American history. Washington, of course, is the hero, the man that won the American War for Independence. But more than that, he was really the glue that held the Republic together for 80 years. And he was the most trusted man in the United States because of what he was willing to do. When the war was over, he marched, basically went into Philadelphia without his army and said, look here, I am turning in my commission. I'm giving up all my political offices. What Washington didn't want to be seen as a dictator. He didn't want to come in and sweep in with an army and say, I'm now the king or dictator of the United States. I'm going to go back to my plantation, Mount Vernon, and I'm going to be a farmer, which is why he's called the American Cincinnatus. Cincinnatus was this Roman general who saved the Republic of Rome and then went back to his farm and picked up the plow again. He was a farmer, called out of retirement, picked up the plow, went back to the plow. So that's exactly what Washington wanted to do. He wanted to be seen as a man who was not ambitious, who wasn't power hungry, and that was really what he said from the beginning. In 1776, when he's selected to be commander of the Continental Army, he said he wasn't up to the task. And Washington did well. Of course, as we talked about with the war, he really didn't win that many battles, but he was able to keep the army in the field, which is what was the important thing for winning the war ultimately. Now, he's going to set a number of precedents that are at least followed in some ways for several generations. Others are just scrapped immediately. But Washington, as the first president of the Constitution, is going to be watched very carefully. And how he handles this position is really how people think the presidency should be, the affairs of the presidency should be conducted. Now, he was unanimously elected in 1788, sworn in at Federal Hall in New York City on April 30th, 1789. And he's really given a blank check for establishing the executive department. Benjamin Franklin had said during the Philadelphia Convention that everyone knows Washington is going to be first, but what happens after Washington? And that was the real question. He believed in a strong central government, but did not want to give the appearance of monarchy. In fact, he turned down titles, things like His High Mightiness and all these other silly things that were being bandied around at the time, and said, look, Mr. President's fine. He wanted to appear very Republican, which that was the idea. Now, the first Vice President of the United States is John Adams, so he came in second in the balloting. That's the way it used to work. Whoever finished first was president, whoever finished second was vice president. So John Adams is vice president. Washington's cabinet is often considered to be an all-star cabinet. Thomas Jefferson is the first Secretary of State. Henry Knox is the first Secretary of War. He actually had this position under the Articles of Confederation, so he just rolled that over. And Alexander Hamilton is the first Secretary of the Treasury. Now, Hamilton was highly influenced by Robert Morris of Pennsylvania. Robert Morris and others in Pennsylvania wanted to have a central banking system in Pennsylvania. When it didn't work there, they thought, we'll just go to the central government and get it. And so Hamilton's views on finance were really molded by other individuals, and Robert Morris had a big role in that. Now, there are 3 major developments during the Washington administration. The first, party system and the power of the general government, is going to be openly discussed. Indian problems in the Old Northwest, and foreign policy. So let's talk about these issues in detail. All right, so let's look at the first one. In 1790, Alexander Hamilton will issue something called the First Report on the Public Credit. And under this plan, the United States was to assume the debts of both the general government that it had under the Articles of Confederation and the state governments. Now, everyone assumed that the general government would assume the debts of the old general government, but not the state governments. What this is doing is actually taking on more debt, and not just that. It's possibly reducing the states to mere provinces, because the states were seen as, they had their own debt. They were sovereign entities in their own way. And so this is seen as an affront to state sovereignty. Now, opponents called this thing the assumption scheme. Southerners feared this would foster centralization. It was unconstitutional. They also thought this would limit state power. And they were right. I mean, that's what Hamilton is trying to do here. Hamilton said that a little bit of debt wasn't a bad thing. In fact, what he's trying to do is establish credit for the United States. If we start paying our debt back, then people will trust to lend money to us. So Southerners were going to block this thing in the Congress. So George Washington will have a conference at Mount Vernon again. He'll have all the important players there, players including Hamilton and Madison, and they'll talk things over. And essentially what will happen is the assumption scheme will go through, but the capital would move from the north to what's now Washington, D.C. So the South will get the capital, which was seen as a compromise, and have a capital closer to the South. It's also in 1790 that Hamilton proposes a Bank of the United States. He believed the national bank was necessary to secure the finances of the United States government. Of course, this, as I said before, this was floated in Pennsylvania but failed and now pushed at the federal level. The question was a bank constitutional? This idea was actually broached in the Philadelphia Convention, and it was turned down. Nobody wanted a central banking system there. And so Hamilton, of course, in arguing for ratification of the Constitution, said that if the powers are not listed in Article 1, Section 8, we can't do it. Well, there's no power in Article 1, Section 8 that says you can charter a bank or charter a any corporation for that matter. And so this thing is immediately blasted as unconstitutional. Jefferson and Madison, in fact, Jefferson, who's Secretary of State, goes to Washington immediately and says, you can't sign this thing into law. This is unconstitutional. Washington agrees. And so he tells James Madison to write a veto message. And he's going to veto the bill. And then he goes to Hamilton. Washington goes to Hamilton and says, look, Hamilton, I'm going to veto this bill. You've got to defend it. You've got to prove to me that it's constitutional. I'll sign it. If you can't prove that, then I'm going to veto the bill. Because Washington looked at the veto power as a way to veto unconstitutional legislation. He thought that was the only time he should use the veto. He doesn't get involved in the workings of the Congress, but he would use the veto if the legislation was purely unconstitutional because he takes an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States. So if Congress is passing unconstitutional legislation, then he can be a block on that. So Hamilton will then go out and he'll take a knight, essentially, and write a defense of the bank. This is often called the loose constructionist position. Jefferson, Madison, the strict constructionist. But Hamilton says, look, you just got to look between the lines. Right? The bank is necessary and proper for the Treasury Department to function correctly. I know it doesn't list it explicitly in Article 1, Section 8, but we do have this necessary and proper clause, and so this is necessary and proper for me to do my job. And Washington will support Hamilton. And this is one of the great mistakes of the Washington administration in supporting a purely unconstitutional piece of legislation. There's nothing in the Constitution, still is nothing in the Constitution that says the central government can charter a bank. But this is part of the origins of the first party system. Jefferson and Madison are hot about this. Hamilton, of course, gets a victory, but we have the first Bank of the United States. So let's talk about how these two parties kind of shake out. On one side, you have Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. They're the Democratic Republicans, or just the Republicans. They believe in a limited central government, a democratic agrarian order. They believe in the individual and the people's capacity to govern. They believed in sound money and property, a broad diffusion of wealth, though, and relative freedom from industrialization, urbanization, and organized finance. What they really feared, though, was a fusion of government and organized finance. They didn't want banks and government getting in bed together because that could produce all kinds of problems. They also generally supported France in foreign policy, and they had their strongest support in the South and among the working class and farmers. So the Democratic Republicans are more of a Southern party, though there are Northern Democratic Republicans, a lot of them. And you have a lot of them in New York City, for example. On the other side, you have Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists. They believe in a very active central government. They believe the government should promote industry, commerce, and finance. They believe in a strong executive, and they generally distrust the people's capacity to govern. They generally supported Great Britain in foreign policy, and they found their strongest support in the North, among the merchant class and initially large planters in the South. So large planters, of course, are making money trading with the North, and that works well for them. So the Federalists what you have here are two distinct groups of people. Now, they don't have parties like we have today with party conventions and party nominations and all that kind of stuff. But they do have groups of people kind of coalescing around certain ideas. And so that really becomes this first party system. Democratic, Republicans, and Federalists. Now, so we've already seen the Bank of the United States was a major issue between these groups. The assumption scheme is a major issue. We'll talk about foreign policy in a minute. But Hamilton, there's other things. So in 1791, Hamilton will propose a tax on liquor. The tax was actually never implemented and later repealed, but farmers were unaware of this. And Democratic Republican clubs will oppose the tax. In fact, it was repealed and nothing was put out about it on purpose because Hamilton knew these Democratic Republican clubs were out there denouncing the tax and they were going to maybe take action against this thing. He saw this as an opportunity to crush his opponents. Now, a tax on liquor is only going to affect people in rural areas for the most part because they're the ones that produce this liquor. They produce corn, they produce wheat, and so you make liquor out of those things. So in 1794, farmers in rural Pennsylvania and other areas will rise up against the tax, and this is often called the Whiskey Rebellion. They dust off an old rallying cry, no taxation without representation. And, of course, the government's response is, well, in 1776, when we talked about this, or 75 or 74, we didn't have any representation. We were virtually represented, but now you've elected these people, so you're going to pay the tax. In fact, President Washington is going to create an army and personally lead a force to put down into Pennsylvania to put down the rebellion. This is unconstitutional, a definitely unconstitutional display of force, because the governor of Pennsylvania has not asked Washington into Pennsylvania. There's actually a portion of the Constitution that says the only time the government can go into a state is if the governor of that state requests the troops be sent in. In fact, they found no one at all. All the people who were involved in this were Democratic Republicans, and they hit each other. So they really don't find anybody. The show of force marches in, but they don't find anyone to prosecute. The one thing that did happen is that all Democratic Republican clubs had ceased to exist, and these people were called terrorists by people like John Marshall and others. We'll talk about John Marshall later. But what this really shows is that there's discontent over Hamilton's economic programs, particularly among Jeffersonians. Now, in 1793, the Supreme Court will issue a very important decision called Chisholm v. Georgia. There was a dispute over the power of the federal court system in relation to the states. Now, during the ratification process, the proponents of the Constitution said that the federal government would never declare a state law unconstitutional or void. That just wouldn't happen. But here what you have is the Supreme Court deciding that states can be sued without their consent. States disagree, and so very quickly the 11th Amendment to the Constitution is added, would be ratified in 1795. This is called state sovereign immunity. What the 11th Amendment says is that states cannot be sued without their consent. So they can just decide they're not going to be sued by anyone. They don't have to show up. The 11th Amendment asserts state sovereignty, and it tries to knock down the power of the federal court. Now, most states don't exercise the 11th Amendment anymore. It's kind of this forgotten amendment, but it's very important. It is a vehicle by which the states can exercise their sovereignty and refuse suits against them. All right, well, let's talk about the problems in the West, frontier problems. So the frontier, of course, is all of this area, everything out here. This is going to be very important for the development of the United States. Now, there was a Creek Indian leader at this time named Alexander McGillivray. He lived from 1750 to 1793. And he led the Creek people to sign a treaty with the United States in 1790 called the Treaty of New York, which was actually composed at Oswego, which is right near Fort Mitchell today. This created the boundaries of modern Alabama, which was one time Creek Nation land. In return for signing this treaty, McGillivray was given an annual salary which he used to purchase 3 plantations and 60 slaves. So this territory in the south here was called the Yazoo Territory. It's basically Alabama, Mississippi. And it's very fertile land, and there's going to be a great big scandal about this later on, the Yazoo controversy. I'll talk about it later. Many Creek people, some Cherokee and Seminole Indians, balked at the treaty. Black Seminole Indians, for example, did not like the agreement to round up fugitive slaves. Some of this part of it. So these Creek Indians then are going to become members of the United States government rounding up fugitive slaves. If there's any fugitive slaves among them, they have to turn them in to United States authorities. Well, these other tribes didn't really care for that too much. It's also in this period of time you have something called the Northwest Indian War. This was led by Little Turtle of the Miami tribe. And essentially what you had on the frontier was tension created by the Treaty of Paris and the refusal of the British to abide by the treaty. They didn't pull their troops off the frontier. And so you have basically the war continuing in the frontier. It's just not a declared war anymore. And the United States would suffer terrible defeat during the war. In fact, the most famous battle is the Battle of the Wabash in 1791. Sometimes it's called St. Clair's defeat. But St. Clair, who is General St. Clair, went out west to try to handle this problem, and his men were routed. And in fact, there were a group of women who followed the camp. They were all killed too, in very horrible ways. So St. Clair limps back to D.C. Washington is furious. And he would send out some peace commissioners. Well, they would be executed. And so really, Washington wants to end this war. He wants to figure out a way to end the war. So eventually the Washington administration settles on General Mad Anthony Wayne as the man who's going to go out west and handle this situation. He's called Black Snake by the Indians because he said he was good at two things, killing Brits and killing Indians. And that was true. He earned his nickname Mad during the American War for Independence in the unorthodox way in which he fought. He was appointed commander of the American Legion in 1794 with the express purpose of winning the Northwest Indian War. He was a very effective general and leader of men. In fact, it used to be as men signed up to fight, they would desert the next day. Well, Wayne is able to keep these guys engaged, and he trains them very hard, and this becomes a very effective fighting force. Which brings us to the Battle of Fallen Timbers of 1794. This is a decisive American victory in the Old Northwest. Wayne, this is basically in Ohio. It's called Fallen Timbers because a tornado went through here not long before this. But what happens is the Indian tribes think that the United States is going to attack at a particular time. Well, the United States doesn't show up to fight. This is the era of pitched battles. So a lot of these men were growing very hungry, so they headed back to the British fort to try to get supplies, food. There was a British fort in the area. And so when the Indian force is at its lowest, Wayne will attack, and it'll be a slaughter. In fact, he warned the Indians that the British won't help them. So these Indians are running back to the British fort, and they close the gates. And in fact, Wayne will ride around the fort taunting the Brits and saying, showing the Indians that they won't even shoot at him. And so the tribes are thoroughly routed. The river ran red with blood that day, and there were about 133 American casualties. This is a thorough, major American victory. And the result will be something called the Treaty of Greenville of 1795. The Indian tribes cede territory in Ohio to the United States. There was a very famous Shawnee war chief named Tecumseh who refused to sign the treaty. And we'll talk about Tecumseh when we get to the War of 1812. But what this is going to do is allow for more substantial settlement of the Northwest Territory. All right, and finally, foreign relations. Washington has problems with both the British and the French during this period of time. When Washington becomes president, the French Revolution begins very quickly, or right around that time. And by late in his first term, there are some really horrible things going on in France. In fact, it's just about the time he's reelected in 1792 that you have the Reign of Terror. So what happens is the United States, of course, is a perpetual ally of the French because of our involvement with France in the American War for Independence. And so the thought is that the United States will help out the French. Well, the French are at war with everybody in the world. And so the British are being rather obnoxious and pressing American sailors. This means they're going out and taking sailors off American ships and forcing them to serve as British sailors. And Washington wants to remain neutral. So, in fact, he's going to issue something called the Neutrality Proclamation of 1793. This was a unilateral move. And according to the Constitution, the president really isn't supposed to be able to do this. In fact, he's called on this. And Madison, then, in the Congress, will pass something called the Neutrality Act of 1794. And so there's going to be this great debate in the newspapers called the Pacificus Helvidius debates. And this is an important series of debates talking about the role of the executive branch, the powers of Congress in relation to foreign policy. And so this really sets the stage for this part of this first party system where you have the Democratic Republicans generally supporting France and the Federalists generally supporting the British. Now, to make matters worse, there is a French emissary in the United States at the time named Citizen Edmond Guéné. And Guéné will press the United States to uphold their treaty of friendship signed during the American War for Independence. But, of course, this could be disastrous for the United States because if the United States supports the French, then they're going to be at war with everybody in the world, including the British. So this really threatens U.S. interests and stability. So they reject Guéné's offer. But Guéné will still run around outfitting American privateers to go sack British ships. Well, the British know this, and so there's a threat of war with Britain over this. So the Washington administration tells Guéné to cease and desist, and if he doesn't, they're going to send him back to France. Well, he doesn't. So they start the process of sending him back to France. Well, as soon as he's going to be sent back to France, the word comes down that if Guéné goes back to France, he's going to have his head chopped off at the guillotine. So he appeals for asylum here in the United States. The U.S. gives it to him. And Guéné will stick around and actually marry the daughter of the governor of New York. Now, it's also in 1794 that Washington, because of our perceived relationship with the French, Washington will send Supreme Court Justice John Jay over to England to discuss the unfriendly relations between the British and the United States. And what results in this is something called Jay's Treaty. This thing was denounced by Democratic Republicans. In fact, John Jay was burned in effigy, meaning they made a dummy of John Jay. They hung him up and they burned him. But what it did was solidify the relationship between Great Britain and the United States, but it really didn't address any substantial issues. There was nothing talked about, really the problem on the frontier or British impressment of sailors. All that stuff really was just left off the table. The only thing that happens here is the United States and the British will become good friends for commercial purposes. This really infuriated the French. So now you've gone from infuriating one side to infuriating the other side, and the United States has gained nothing out of it. Washington does get an important victory for his administration, though, through something called Pinckney's Treaty with Spain. This established free navigation of the Mississippi River, which, of course, was essential for Western farmers, Southern farmers trying to get their goods out to market through the Gulf of Mexico. All right, well, what you can say about Washington's administration? I mean, he decides to retire at his second term, so he's going to serve from 1789 to 1797. He actually wanted to retire after his first term, and in fact, he almost didn't even make it to his first term. He almost died of anthrax poisoning before he even got to the Capitol in 1789. But his farewell address, which is very famous, was actually written by Hamilton. He warned Americans to avoid foreign conflicts and entangling alliances, that's his word. He warned Americans to avoid political parties or factionalism. But Washington's going to establish a two-term precedent here. He's going to step down. And in fact, every American president served 2 terms or less up until Franklin Roosevelt. Now, that didn't mean people didn't think about running again. In fact, U.S. Grant thought about running for 3 terms. But the fact is, everyone until Franklin Roosevelt only ran twice. Roosevelt's the first one to break that, and of course today there's an amendment to the Constitution that says that the president can only serve 2 terms. Washington really established the role of the president in American politics, but not a whole lot of people follow this today. In fact, nobody follows this today. It's seen as very antiquated. But the president wasn't supposed to have a large directive role in the government. He's just kind of supposed to sit back there and enforce whatever the Congress passes. If they pass something unconstitutional, he's supposed to block it. So that was the way that Washington conceived of the executive branch. It's just not going to be carried out that way from this point forward. Washington will die in 1799 on his farm, very shortly after leaving office. So the great hero of the American War for Independence, the man who was seen as in so many ways invincible, that now dies at 1799. So that's it for this presentation. We'll pick up with the John Adams administration next time. I'll see you then.